In 476 AD, the Roman Forum stands largely empty as weeds grow between marble paving stones that once rang with the footsteps of senators, magistrates, merchants, and the citizens of the greatest empire the Mediterranean world has ever known, the ancient heart of Roman power, where laws were debated and decrees announced, where triumphal processions celebrated military victories and political assemblies shaped policy, now experiences a silence that feels less like abandonment and more like absence, as though the empire has not fallen so much as wandered away, forgetting to return. The marble temples still stand, their columns reaching toward the Roman sky with undiminished architectural confidence. The basilicas that once housed law courts and commercial exchanges remain structurally sound, their vast interiors now hosting only echoes and the occasional gathering of the curious or nostalgic. Nothing has burned. No barbarian army has sacked these sacred precincts in living memory. The physical infrastructure of empire persists while the empire itself has somehow ceased to exist. The Senate House in Rome opens without an emperor's summons and closes without debate, its massive bronze doors swinging on hinges installed centuries ago, admitting senators who arrive from habit or hope rather than from any clear sense of purpose or authority. The ancient institution continues its rituals, the taking of auspices, the reading of correspondence, the formal acknowledgement of precedent and tradition. Yet these ceremonies now occur in a strange vacuum of power. There is no emperor to propose legislation, no imperial mandate to execute, no clear source of the authority that the Senate once claimed to advise and occasionally to resist. The senators themselves, those who still bother to attend, speak the language of Roman governance, cite the traditions of republican virtue, invoke the glory of ancestors who built this empire. But their words echo in a chamber that no longer connects to the machinery of power. They are performing a play whose audience has departed, maintaining forms whose substance has dissolved. Imperial standards remain stored in armories with no reigning Augustus to receive them. The military insignia that once represented the authority of Rome now reduced to museum pieces, objects of historical curiosity, rather than symbols of living power. The legionary eagles, the vexilla of auxiliary units, the personal standards of emperors, all carefully maintained by keepers of tradition who continue their duties despite the absence of the imperial administration that once employed them. These standards represent not just military authority but the continuity of Roman power across generations, the unbroken chain of command stretching back to Augustus and beyond him to the Republic. Yet now they sit in storage, waiting for an emperor who will not come, symbolizing an authority that no longer exists. The weapons are still polished, the banners still repaired, the traditions still observed, but the empire that gave these objects meaning has quietly evaporated. Bishop Simplicius administers Rome's population while imperial authority remains absent, the Christian Church stepping into the administrative void with a mixture of spiritual mission and practical necessity. The bishop oversees grain distribution, settles disputes, maintains public order, and provides the organizational structure that imperial bureaucracy once supplied. This is not usurpation but necessity. Someone must manage the practical demands of urban life. And in the absence of imperial prefects and provincial governors, the church finds itself inheriting responsibilities by default. The bishop operates from episcopal buildings rather than imperial palaces, draws authority from spiritual rather than political legitimacy, answers to ecclesiastical rather than imperial hierarchy. Yet the functions are remarkably similar. Rome is still administered, its population still governed, its civic needs still addressed. What has changed is not the presence of order but its source, not the fact of administration but its justification. Roman roads continue to carry merchants, messengers, and pilgrims across Italy and beyond. The great arteries of empire still functioning as designed despite the disappearance of the empire itself. The Via Appia, the Via Flaminia, the countless other roads built by Roman engineers with Roman labor and Roman precision all remain open, maintained sometimes by local authorities, and sometimes by the travelers themselves, continuing to facilitate the movement of people and goods that had been their purpose since construction. Merchants transport wine and olive oil, ceramics and textiles, the ordinary commerce of Mediterranean life continuing as though nothing has changed. Messengers carry letters and documents between cities, maintaining networks of communication that imperial administration once coordinated. Pilgrims journey to holy sites, following routes established by centuries of Roman travel. The roads remember their imperial purpose even as the empire forgets how to use them. Roman law courts still cite imperial precedents despite the disappearance of imperial command. Jurists and advocates continuing to argue cases using the accumulated legal wisdom of centuries, referencing the edicts of emperors who are long dead and the interpretations of legal scholars whose world no longer exists. The law itself that most Roman achievements, the codification of justice into principles that transcend individual rulers or particular circumstances, continues to function as a system of thought and practice even without the imperial authority that once enforced it. Judges hear cases and render verdicts. Lawyers construct arguments from precedent and principle. Litigants seek justice through legal process rather than through force. Roman law survives Roman sovereignty, the intellectual architecture of justice outlasting the political architecture of empire. The deposition of Romulus Augustulus passes without riots or widespread violence, the removal of the last Western emperor occurring with an almost bureaucratic quietness that would be anticlimactic if it were not so revealing. Romulus Augustulus, whose name unconsciously mocks Roman grandeur, little Augustus echoing the founder of empire, is neither killed nor humiliated but simply pensioned off, sent to retirement with an income sufficient for aristocratic comfort, removed from power without ceremony because the power he nominally held had already ceased to mean anything. There are no mobs demanding his restoration, no loyal legions marching to avenge his deposition, no senatorial faction plotting his return. His removal occasions less disruption than the appointment of a minor magistrate might have generated in earlier centuries, because by 476 AD, everyone understands that the title of Western Roman Emperor has become an empty formality, a role without authority, a position without power. Odoacer sends imperial insignia eastward to Constantinople rather than claiming the throne himself, a gesture that crystallizes the strange political reality of this moment. Odoacer, the Germanic commander who has just deposed the Western emperor, makes no claim to imperial dignity himself. He does not crown himself emperor, does not assert independent sovereignty, does not declare a new dynasty or a break with Rome. Instead, he sends the regalia, the purple robes, the diadem, the symbols of imperial authority to Zeno, the emperor in Constantinople, effectively declaring that the Western imperial office is unnecessary because one emperor suffices for the whole Roman world. This is not conquest but administrative consolidation, not barbarian triumph but pragmatic reorganization. Odoacer governs Italy as a Roman official, a magister militum, drawing legitimacy from the surviving Eastern Empire rather than from any personal claim to power. The fiction of Roman unity is maintained by acknowledging that Rome now has a single center, and that center is no longer in the West. The Western Roman Empire ends without fire, sack, or formal decree, its termination marked by this quiet sending of insignia rather than by battlefield defeat or constitutional crisis. There is no dramatic last stand, no final siege, no apocalyptic destruction of the kind that Romans had witnessed when Alaric sacked Rome in 410 or when Carthage fell to Roman arms centuries earlier. The end comes not through external catastrophe but through internal dissolution, the imperial system simply ceasing to function as the administrative, military, and political structures that constituted empire gradually lose coherence and finally stop operating altogether. Future historians will mark 476 as the fall of Rome, but people living through this year would struggle to identify any single moment of collapse, any clear before and after that separates empire from its absence. Civic life persists without the political structure that once unified it, creating a landscape of continuing normality that makes the absence of empire all the more uncanny. Cities still govern themselves through councils and magistrates, using forms that echo imperial administration, but deriving authority from local consensus rather than from Rome. Markets still function, churches still provide services, agricultural estates still produce food, craftsmen still practice trades. The rhythms of daily life continue with remarkable consistency despite the disappearance of the overarching political framework that had, for centuries, connected these local activities into an empire-wide system. It's as though someone has removed a building's foundation while somehow leaving the structure standing, the edifice of Roman civilization remaining visible and functional, even as the empire that built it has vanished. Observers note that civilization remains intact while empire dissolves, a paradox that challenges assumptions about the relationship between political power and social order. The absence of imperial authority does not produce chaos or barbarism, does not result in the breakdown of law or the collapse of culture. Instead, it reveals that much of what made Roman civilization Roman was never dependent on the emperor or the imperial administration, but rather inhered in the habits, institutions, and practices that had become so deeply embedded in Mediterranean life that they could continue independently. Romanness, it turns out, is more durable than Rome itself, a cultural identity and set of practices that transcends political sovereignty and survives the dissolution of the state that created it. The absence feels administrative rather than catastrophic, more like the slow shutdown of a complex organization than like the violent overthrow of a regime. Imperial offices stop being filled, not because they are abolished, but because no one bothers to appoint new office holders. Administrative correspondence ceases, not because it is prohibited, but because there is no one to write to. Tax collection becomes irregular and then stops entirely, not through rebellion, but through the gradual collapse of the bureaucratic machinery necessary to assess, collect, and distribute revenue. The empire ends the way a business might close after bankruptcy, through the accumulation of small failures, through the gradual inability to perform necessary functions, through the quiet cessation of activities that once defined its existence. Rome once governed the Mediterranean through law, discipline, and logistics, creating an empire that was as much administrative achievement as military conquest, as much a triumph of organization as of legions. The Romans built roads that connected provinces to the capital, established legal frameworks that governed relations across cultures and regions, created bureaucratic systems that could manage the complexity of empire-wide taxation and defense. They standardized weights and measures, coined money that circulated from Britain to Mesopotamia, imposed Latin as the language of administration and law. They turned conquest into governance, transforming military domination into civic integration, building an empire that was not merely a collection of subject territories, but an interconnected system of cities, regions, and peoples united by Roman law and Roman administration. Roman order outlives Roman sovereignty, the systems and structures created by centuries of imperial development persisting after the political authority that created them has ceased to function. This persistence is not accidental, but rather reflects the fundamental nature of what Rome built, not merely a state held together by force, but a civilization organized by law, an order embedded in institutions and practices that had become second nature to the peoples of the Mediterranean world. The roads still function because they are physical infrastructure whose utility transcends the empire that built them. The laws still apply because they represent accumulated wisdom about justice and governance that remains valid regardless of political circumstances. The administrative practices still make sense because they solve real problems of organization and coordination that don't disappear with the emperor. Historians confront a paradox: collapse without collapse, ending without catastrophe, fall without the dramatic downfall that the word fall implies. How does one narrate the end of Rome when the end looks so much like continuation? How does one mark the moment of collapse when people continued living Roman lives, speaking Roman languages, identifying as Romans for centuries after the supposed fall? The traditional narrative of decline and fall, Gibbon's grand tragedy of a great civilization destroyed by internal decay and barbarian invasion, captures something real about Rome's transformation but misses the strange quiet of this actual ending, the way empire simply evaporates without the apocalyptic finality that fall suggests. The challenge is to understand not why Rome fell, but how it could end while so much of it continued. The question emerges quietly inside abandoned basilicas and silent forums, in the gap between the continuity of civilization and the disappearance of empire, in the tension between what persists and what has been lost. The question is not what destroyed Rome, but rather, how did Rome end without ending? How did a political structure vanish while the civilization it organized continued? How did an empire that had endured for centuries, that had survived civil wars and barbarian invasions and economic crises and political upheavals, simply cease to function without anyone quite noticing the exact moment of cessation? These questions have occupied historians for 15 centuries, generating libraries of explanation and interpretation. Yet the mystery remains because the answer seems to shift depending on what aspect of Rome we examine: the political structure, the economic system, the military organization, the cultural identity. How does a system built on adaptability lose the ability to adapt? This is perhaps the deepest question, the one that cuts to the heart of Rome's paradox. Rome rose to power through pragmatic flexibility, through willingness to incorporate defeated enemies as citizens, to adopt useful foreign practices, to evolve institutions in response to changing circumstances. The Republic created dictatorship as a temporary emergency measure, invented the office of censor to manage social change, expanded citizenship to bind conquered peoples to Roman interest. Even the transformation to empire represented a kind of adaptation, however traumatic, a response to the administrative and military challenges that republican institutions could no longer handle. Yet somewhere in this history of successful adaptation, Rome lost its adaptive capacity, became rigid where it had been flexible, conservative where it had been innovative, unable to evolve the very institutions whose evolution had made Rome great. Rome conquered the world through order yet lost control of order itself, a formulation that captures the tragic irony at the center of Roman history. The disciplined legions, the rational bureaucracy, the systematic law, these were the tools of Roman power, the mechanisms that transformed military conquest into lasting empire, that turned subject peoples into citizens, that made Roman governance seem not merely powerful but superior to the alternatives. Yet this order, so effective at expansion and organization, proved brittle in ways its creators never anticipated. The very systems that made Rome strong made it inflexible. The institutions that provided stability resisted reform. The order that conquered the world became an obstacle to the adaptation necessary for survival. In trying to preserve Rome, Romans transformed it into something that could not be preserved, only replaced. Roman institutions remain visible but hollow, like shells from which the living organism has departed, maintaining their forms without the functions that once gave those forms meaning. The Senate still meets but no longer governs. The legal system still operates but no longer derives authority from imperial command. The administrative titles still exist but no longer convey power. This hollowness is more unsettling than destruction would be, for destruction at least provides clear endings and new beginnings, while this continuing presence of empty forms creates confusion about what has actually ended and what merely continues in diminished form. Future generations will look back on 476 and see a clear dividing line: the fall of Rome, the end of antiquity, the beginning of medieval Europe. But for people living through these years, the experience is of gradual erosion rather than sudden collapse, of institutions losing substance while maintaining appearance, of empire fading away while no one can quite identify when it ceased to exist. The mystery crystallizes around absence rather than destruction, around what is not there rather than what has been lost, around the puzzle of how something as massive and complex as the Roman Empire can simply dissolve without leaving a clear record of its dissolution. If Rome had fallen to a barbarian conquest, if it had been overthrown by internal revolution, if it had collapsed in some dramatic catastrophe, we would at least understand the mechanism of its end. But instead, Rome seems to have wandered away from itself, to have gradually abandoned its own institutions, to have ceased being an empire through a process so gradual and so undramatic that no one living through it could identify the exact moment when empire became memory, when Rome stopped being a place of power and became merely an idea, a name, a ghost haunting the geography it once commanded. This is the enigma that history must explain. How does an empire end without falling? Early Rome develops along the Tiber River among hostile Latin and Etruscan neighbors, a small settlement occupying 7 hills in a region crowded with competing peoples, surrounded by rivals who would gladly destroy any neighbor showing weakness. The location is strategic but vulnerable. The Tiber provides water and commerce. The hills offer defensive positions, but the surrounding plain makes Rome accessible to enemies from multiple directions. This geography shapes Roman character from the beginning, creating a culture that values military readiness, collective defense, and the coordination of resources for survival. Unlike Greece with its natural barriers of mountains and sea, or Egypt with its protective deserts, Rome has no geographic shields against invasion. Safety must be created through organization, through discipline, through the construction of walls and the training of citizens to defend them. Geographic vulnerability encourages discipline, collective defense, and military organization in ways that become fundamental to Roman identity and governance. Every male citizen expects to serve in the military, not as a professional soldier, but as a farmer or craftsman who sets aside his tools to take up arms when the community faces threat. This citizen-soldier tradition means that military and civic identity merge. That defense of the state is not delegated to specialists, but remains the responsibility of all who benefit from Rome's security. The organization required for military effectiveness, clear chains of command, adherence to orders, acceptance of hierarchy becomes the template for civic organization as well, creating a political culture that values order, respects authority, and prioritizes collective needs over individual desires. Rome learns early that survival requires cooperation, that freedom depends on discipline, that power comes from organization. Roman citizens organize land, labor, and defense through shared obligation, creating institutions that distribute both the burdens and benefits of collective life. The earliest Roman assemblies organized themselves by military unit rather than by wealth or birth, emphasizing that citizenship means above all the obligation to defend the community. Land ownership conveys not just economic benefit but civic responsibility. The duty to serve when called, to contribute to public works, to participate in governance. This reciprocity between rights and obligations, between what the individual receives from the community and what the community requires from the individual, becomes central to Roman political thought. One is not simply a Roman by birth or residence, but by participation in the shared enterprise of Rome, by fulfilling obligations that make community possible, by contributing to the collective power that protects all members. Expansion across Italy creates alliances bound by Roman law rather than ethnicity, establishing a pattern that will characterize Roman imperialism for centuries. When Rome conquers neighboring peoples, it does not simply subject them, but incorporates them into varying degrees of relationship with Rome itself. Some become full citizens, others receive limited citizenship, still others become allies with treaty obligations but substantial autonomy. What binds these diverse peoples is not shared blood or culture, but shared law, the extension of Roman legal framework to govern relationships between Rome and its subordinates. This legal approach to empire allows Rome to expand without dissolving into ethnic chaos, to maintain unity across diversity, to create a common Roman identity that transcends the particular identities of Latins, Etruscans, Samnites, and eventually the peoples of the entire Mediterranean world. Romanness becomes a matter of law and institution rather than of ethnicity or culture. Colonies extend Roman identity without dissolving local customs, creating a model of imperial expansion that proves remarkably successful. When Rome establishes a colony, a new settlement in conquered territory populated by Roman citizens, it creates a miniature Rome, complete with Roman political institutions, Roman law, Roman urban planning. Yet these colonies coexist with existing communities, trading with them, intermarrying with them, gradually creating hybrid cultures that are both Roman and local. This flexibility allows Rome to expand its power without triggering the kind of cultural resistance that might arise from more heavy-handed imposition. People become Roman gradually, through participation in Roman institutions and adoption of Roman practices, rather than through forced assimilation. The result is an empire that, for all its violence in conquest, proves relatively successful at maintaining peace and stability. Once conquest is achieved, roads connect settlements into an integrated political organism, transforming a collection of cities and territories into something that functions as a coherent whole. Roman roads are engineering marvels, built to last centuries, designed for rapid military movement, but serving equally to facilitate commerce, communication, and cultural exchange. A message sent from Rome can reach the northern frontier in days, allowing central coordination of policy and rapid response to crisis. Merchants can transport goods across vast distances with reasonable safety and speed, integrating regional economies into Mediterranean-wide markets. Cultural practices, religious ideas, and technological innovations spread along these roads, creating increasing uniformity across Rome's expanding territory. The roads are both metaphor and reality for what Rome accomplishes: the binding of diverse peoples and regions into a system whose unity rests on infrastructure, both physical and institutional. The Roman Republic establishes consuls, magistrates, and assemblies to distribute power, creating a governmental system that attempts to balance aristocratic and popular elements to prevent any individual from dominating the state. To ensure that political power remains constrained by law and tradition, two consuls share executive authority, each able to veto the other, serving one-year terms that prevent accumulation of personal power. Magistrates elected from the citizen body fill specialized roles. Praetors administer justice. Aediles manage public works. Quaestors handle finance, creating a government of multiple offices rather than concentrated authority. Popular assemblies vote on legislation and elect magistrates, providing citizens with direct participation in governance. The system is complex, inefficient, and often gridlocked by rival factions, but it is also remarkably resistant to tyranny, to the seizure of power by individuals or groups, to the kind of political instability that plagued many ancient states. The Senate emerges as a stabilizing aristocratic institution, a council of former magistrates whose collective wisdom and experience guide policy, whose prestige gives weight to decisions, whose continuity provides institutional memory across the annual turnover of elected officials. Technically, the Senate is advisory. It cannot make law, cannot command armies, cannot directly govern provinces, but in practice, senatorial authority dominates Roman politics. Senators are Rome's leading families, the men whose ancestors built the Republic, whose wealth and connections make them indispensable to governance, whose commitment to tradition provides stability across generations. The Senate represents continuity, experience, and collective aristocratic interest, serving as ballast against the potentially destabilizing effects of popular politics and military ambition. It is conservative by design, resistant to change, committed to precedent, valuing continuity over innovation, traits that serve Rome well in its early centuries but become problematic as circumstances change. The 12 tables codify law as public and binding, establishing the principle that law transcends individual interpretation, that justice must be administered according to known rules rather than at the whim of powerful individuals. Before the 12 tables, law in Rome is customary and controlled by patrician magistrates who interpret tradition as suits their interests. The codification makes law visible and contestable, allowing plebeians to demand justice according to written standards rather than according to aristocratic convenience. This moment establishes law as central to Roman identity, as the mechanism through which power is constrained and society organized. Roman law becomes increasingly sophisticated over centuries, developing concepts of property, contract, tort, and procedure that influence Western legal thought to the present day. But the principle established by the 12 tables, that law must be public, knowable, and binding on all remains fundamental. Citizen soldiers defend both farms and republic, embodying the intimate connection between military service and civic identity. The typical Roman soldier is a property-owning farmer who serves in the legions when called and returns to his fields when the campaign season ends. This means the army has a direct stake in Roman prosperity and stability. Soldiers are defending their own interests. It also means military service is distributed widely across the citizen body rather than concentrated in a professional class, preventing the army from becoming an independent power base separate from civilian society. The citizen-soldier ideal embodies Roman values, duty, discipline, collective defense, subordination of individual interest to common good. It works brilliantly for a city-state engaged in regional wars, less well for an empire requiring permanent garrisons across vast distances. Roman political culture prizes restraint, tradition, and precedent, valuing the inherited wisdom of ancestors over innovation, respecting established practice over creative experimentation, seeing virtue in continuity rather than change. This conservatism serves Rome well in maintaining stability, in preventing the kind of radical political experiments that destabilize other states, in ensuring that power transitions according to understood norms rather than through violence. Romans look to history for guidance. Cite the Mos Maiorum, the way of the ancestors, as justification for practice. Resist departures from tradition as dangerous innovation. This reverence for the past creates strong institutions and predictable governance, but it also makes adaptation difficult, reform suspect, and change traumatic when it becomes unavoidable. What begins as admirable stability eventually becomes problematic rigidity. Shared governance appears to prevent tyranny, and for centuries this appearance matches reality. Rome's republican system successfully prevents any individual from seizing permanent power, constrains aristocratic ambition through institutional checks, maintains a rough balance between competing interests and factions. The system's complexity, its distribution of authority across multiple offices and assemblies, its annual rotation of magistrates, all work to prevent concentration of power. Romans can point to this success as validation of their system, as proof that their institutions are superior to monarchies and tyrannies that plague other states. Yet this confidence in institutions creates a blind spot, an assumption that structures which have worked will continue working, that the system which prevented tyranny in the past will prevent it in the future regardless of changing circumstances. Military success reinforces belief in divine favor, creating a feedback loop where Roman victories prove Roman virtue, which justifies Roman expansion, which generates more victories. Romans interpret their military achievements through a religious lens. Rome conquers because the gods favor Rome, and the gods favor Rome because Romans honor them properly, maintain proper religious observances, conduct themselves with virtue. This belief provides psychological reinforcement for Roman imperialism, making expansion seem not merely advantageous but righteous, not simply conquest but the fulfillment of divine destiny. The ideology makes Roman domination feel legitimate to Romans themselves, reduces cognitive dissonance about the violence of conquest, frames imperialism as duty rather than aggression. It also makes Romans dangerously resistant to learning from defeat, interpreting military setbacks as moral failures, requiring restoration of virtue rather than as signs that military or political strategy needs revision. Expansion validates institutional superiority, convincing Romans that their system of governance, law, and military organization is objectively better than alternatives, that Roman success proves Roman methods right, that the empire itself is evidence of institutional excellence. If Rome's republican institutions were not superior, how could they have produced such extraordinary power? If Roman law and administration were not more rational and effective than competitors, how could Rome have conquered and held such vast territories? This circular reasoning success proves institutions. Institutions explain success makes Romans increasingly confident in their system and increasingly resistant to questioning its limitations. The very success of Rome blinds Romans to the problems that success creates, to the ways expansion strains institutions designed for a city-state, to the growing gap between republican forms and imperial realities. Yet beneath this confidence and success, quiet fault lines begin to appear, subtle but significant cracks in the republican system that will eventually widen into chasms. Roman elites accumulate wealth faster than institutions evolve, as conquest brings treasure, land, and slaves into Roman hands at rates that transform economic relationships. The wealth flows disproportionately to aristocrats who command armies and govern provinces, creating levels of inequality that earlier Roman society never experienced. The old model of citizen soldiers farming modest plots gives way to a new reality of vast estates worked by slave labor and owned by a small aristocratic class, while many former farmers drift to Rome seeking employment and sustenance. This economic transformation undermines the social basis of republican institutions, which assumed a citizenry of roughly equal property owners, not a society divided between wealthy elites and urban poor. Provincial administration strains republican norms designed for a city-state, as Rome attempts to govern territories across the Mediterranean using institutions created for managing Italy. Republican offices are annual and limited, designed to prevent accumulation of power. But governing a province effectively requires continuity and substantial authority. Provincial governors wield enormous power far from Rome's restraining influence, commanding military forces, administering justice, collecting taxes, all with minimal oversight. The opportunities for enrichment and abuse are obvious, the safeguards minimal. Romans assume that virtue and tradition will constrain governors, that aristocratic honor will prevent gross exploitation, that senatorial status carries obligations as well as privileges. These assumptions work imperfectly even in the best cases and fail entirely when governors lack virtue or when circumstances create temptations too great to resist. Military commands grow longer and geographically distant, transforming the nature of military service and the relationship between generals and soldiers. What begins as seasonal campaigns near Rome becomes multi-year commands in Spain, Gaul. The East campaigns that take soldiers far from their farms for years at a time, that create permanent military establishments in provincial territories, that give generals sustained contact with their troops. The old citizen-soldier model assumes soldiers serve briefly and return home, maintaining their civilian identity and economic independence. But soldiers serving years in distant provinces become dependent on their commanders for pay, for booty, for land grants upon discharge. Their loyalty shifts from abstract devotion to Rome toward concrete dependence on the general who provides for their welfare. The army becomes increasingly professional, increasingly separate from civilian society, increasingly a tool that ambitious generals can use for political purposes. Generals gain loyalty through pay, land grants, and shared campaigns, creating personal bonds that begin to rival or exceed soldiers' attachment to the Republic itself. When soldiers serve under a general for years, fight beside him, share dangers and victories, receive rewards distributed through his authority, they naturally develop loyalty to him personally rather than to the distant and abstract notion of Senate and people of Rome. Generals understand this dynamic and cultivate it deliberately, providing for their soldiers' welfare, advocating for their interests, promising rewards upon discharge. The result is the emergence of personal armies, legions that identify with their commander and will follow him even against Rome if he commands it. This transformation from civic militia to professional army loyal to individuals represents a fundamental change in the nature of Roman military power, one that republican institutions are not designed to handle. Economic inequality grows beneath civic ritual and tradition, hidden by the forms of republican governance, but increasingly shaping political reality. The gap between rich and poor widens dramatically as conquest enriches elites, while many ordinary citizens lose their farms to debt or cannot compete with slave labor. The traditional social compact that all citizens share in Rome's prosperity, that political participation reflects economic stake in community, that Rome's success benefits all Romans begins to break down. Yet the forms remain unchanged. Citizens still vote in assemblies, magistrates are still elected. The outward appearance of republican governance persists even as the social reality that made those forms functional erodes. Romans continue performing the rituals of republican politics while the republic itself transforms into something quite different. The system appears permanent because the system succeeds. And this appearance of permanence is perhaps the greatest danger of all. Romans living in the late Republic have centuries of evidence that their system works, that republican institutions provide stability and generate power, that Rome's way of organizing society and government is superior to alternatives. This success breeds confidence, even complacency, about institutional resilience. If the system has survived this long, why would it fail now? If republican institutions have handled previous crises, why should current problems prove insurmountable? This faith in institutions, this assumption of permanence, makes Romans slow to recognize when circumstances have changed in fundamental ways, slow to understand that institutions which work brilliantly under certain conditions may fail catastrophically when those conditions change. The very success that validates Roman institutions blinds Romans to the moment when those institutions cease to be adequate to changed circumstances. The transformation from republic to empire does not happen in a single moment or through a single decision, but unfolds across a century of crisis, civil war, and constitutional improvisation as Romans struggle to adapt republican institutions to imperial realities, and in the process fundamentally alter the nature of Roman governance. Gaius Marius reforms the army by recruiting landless citizens, a seemingly pragmatic response to a military manpower shortage that has profound political consequences. Traditionally, Roman soldiers had to meet a property qualification. Military service was both right and obligation of property-owning citizens who had a stake in defending Rome. But by the late 2nd century BCE, wars of conquest have created a class of landless citizens, men who lack the property to qualify for traditional military service. Marius opens military service to these men, creating a professional army recruited from the poor rather than a citizen militia recruited from property owners. This solves the immediate problem of military manpower but transforms the army's relationship to the state. Military service shifts from civic duty to professional dependence, fundamentally altering the social compact between soldier and state. The old citizen soldier served because defending Rome meant defending his farm, his family, his stake in Roman prosperity. The new professional soldier serves because military service offers economic opportunity otherwise unavailable, a chance to earn rewards that civilian life cannot provide. This makes soldiers dependent on military success and on commanders who can distribute the fruits of that success. A general who leads his troops to victory and ensures they receive appropriate rewards earns fierce loyalty. A senate that tries to deny soldiers their promised land grants earns resentment. The army becomes an interest group within the state rather than an embodiment of the state itself, with loyalties and demands that can conflict with broader republican interests. Lucius Cornelius Sulla, marches on Rome using Roman legions, shattering the sacred principle that military force must not be used in domestic politics, that the boundary between military and civilian authority must remain inviolable. Sulla, locked in political conflict with rivals, brings his army to Rome and seizes control of the city by force. This is not foreign invasion or slave rebellion, but Roman soldiers, commanded by a Roman general, occupying Rome itself to settle a political dispute. The precedent is catastrophic. If military force can be used to settle domestic political conflicts, then politics becomes a contest of armed strength rather than a process of debate and voting. If generals can march on Rome when political decisions go against them, then constitutional norms become meaningless. Sulla eventually retires and attempts to restore republican governance, but the precedent remains. Military force has been shown to trump political authority, and ambitious generals will remember political violence becomes a tool of reform, normalized through repetition, even as each instance shocks contemporaries and is justified as exceptional. Sulla's march on Rome is followed by proscriptions, lists of political enemies who may be killed with impunity, their property confiscated. Political rivalries that once would have been fought through rhetoric and voting now end in murder and confiscation. Each perpetrator justifies his violence as response to previous violence, as restoration of order, as defense of republican virtue against enemies who have abandoned republican norms. Yet each episode of violence makes the next more likely. Each breakdown of law makes law weaker. Each use of force makes force seem more legitimate as political tool. The Republic begins consuming itself, turning its military might inward, discovering that the power that conquered the world can also destroy the state that created it. Pompey Magnus commands vast territories through extraordinary grants, accumulating powers that would have been unthinkable in earlier republican practice, yet are now justified as necessary to address crises that normal republican institutions cannot handle. Pompey receives commands covering entire regions: Spain, the eastern Mediterranean, the seas themselves rather than single provinces. He is granted authority to raise troops, make war and peace, appoint subordinates, all without the usual senatorial oversight. These powers are technically temporary, granted for specific purposes, but they represent an enormous concentration of authority in a single individual, exactly what republican institutions were designed to prevent. Yet Pompey does not use this power to overthrow the Republic. He accepts senatorial authority, retires when his commands end, attempts to work within republican norms. His example shows that individuals can hold extraordinary power without destroying republican governance. But it also normalizes such grants, making them precedents for others who may be less respectful of republican tradition. Julius Caesar governs Gaul with personal armies and independent authority, conducting a decade-long campaign of conquest that makes him fantastically wealthy, provides his soldiers with enormous plunder, creates legions intensely loyal to him personally, and establishes him as military hero whose fame rivals or exceeds any living Roman. Caesar's conquest of Gaul is a monument to Roman military prowess, extending Roman power into territories that had resisted previous attempts at subjugation. But it also represents an independent power base operating beyond senatorial control, a personal enterprise that enriches Caesar and his soldiers while making them increasingly separate from the political community of Rome. Caesar's legions are not defending Roman territory but conquering new lands for Caesar's glory, fighting not for Rome but for their commander, creating wealth and power that Caesar will eventually turn against the Republic itself. Julius Caesar crosses the Rubicon River in 49 BCE, the moment that later historians will mark as the point of no return, the instant when civil war becomes inevitable and the Republic's fate is sealed. The Rubicon is the boundary between Caesar's province of Cisalpine Gaul and Italy proper. Roman law forbids generals from bringing armies into Italy without senatorial authorization. By crossing with his legions, Caesar commits treason, declares war on the Roman state, transforms political rivalry into military conflict. He supposedly says, "Alea iacta est." The die is cast, recognizing that this decision cannot be undone, that crossing this boundary means civil war and the destruction of either Caesar or his enemies. The river itself is small and unremarkable, but its symbolic weight is immense. It represents the boundary between military and civilian authority, between provincial command and domestic politics, between accepted practice and revolutionary action. The sacred boundary protecting republican order collapses in the moment of Caesar's crossing, and no force proves able to restore it. The boundary was never physical but constitutional, never enforced by walls or garrisons but by shared acceptance of norms, by collective agreement that certain things must not be done if the republic is to survive. Caesar violates this norm, and when he does, he discovers that nothing stops him except the military force of his enemies. There is no constitutional mechanism that can enforce the boundary once someone with an army decides to cross it. The republic reveals itself as sustained not by institutions but by consent, not by legal structures but by voluntary acceptance of limits, not by enforcement but by shared commitment to norms. When that commitment fails, when someone with military power decides that political stakes are worth violating sacred principles, the institutions that appeared so strong prove hollow. Civil war erupts between Roman factions rather than foreign enemies, turning the military might that built the empire inward against itself. Caesar pursues his enemies, Pompey and the Optimates who support him across the Mediterranean. The same legions that conquered Gaul now fight other Roman legions. The tactics and discipline that had defeated foreign enemies now serve to kill fellow Romans. The resources accumulated through centuries of conquest are consumed in fratricidal conflict. This is not the first Roman civil war, but it is the most consequential, the one that marks the Republic's inability to contain the political conflicts that Republican institutions were designed to mediate and resolve. The citizen army that was meant to defend Rome now fights to determine who will control Rome. Loyalty to generals trumping loyalty to state. Military power replacing political authority as the ultimate arbiter of conflict. Supporters see Caesar as a restorer of stability, arguing that he uses extraordinary means only because the Republic's enemies have made constitutional governance impossible. Caesar claims he fights to defend his dignitas and the rights of tribunes, to restore proper governance against an oligarchic faction that has corrupted republican institutions. His supporters point out that the Optimates violated norms first, that Caesar merely responds to their provocations, that extraordinary circumstances justify extraordinary measures. This interpretation sees Caesar not as republic destroyer but as republic savior, using force to rescue Rome from a corrupt elite that has abandoned republican virtue. The argument has enough truth to be persuasive. There is real corruption, real dysfunction in late republican politics. Caesar's solution is to concentrate power in himself, to bypass the institutions that have failed, to substitute personal authority for institutional legitimacy. Opponents condemn Caesar as a tyrant, destroying liberty, seeing in his actions the end of republican governance and the beginning of autocracy, the replacement of law with will, of shared governance with personal rule. To the Optimates, Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon is not justified response, but revolutionary seizure of power, not restoration but destruction, not salvation but the murder of the Republic itself. They see clearly what Caesar's rule means: the end of senatorial authority, the reduction of magistracies to empty honors, the transformation of republican offices into tools of personal power. Better to fight and lose than to accept tyranny. Better to die defending republican liberty than to live as subjects of a dictator. This principled resistance makes Caesar's opponents heroic in the eyes of later republicans, but also ensures the continuation of civil war, the destruction of the very republic they fight to preserve. The Roman Senate struggles to assert authority over victorious generals, discovering that constitutional right means nothing without the power to enforce it. The Senate can pass decrees, but if generals with armies refuse to obey those decrees, What can the Senate do? It can declare enemies of the state. But if those enemies command loyal legions, the declaration is mere words. Constitutional authority has been revealed as a fiction sustained only by consent. When consent fails, when generals decide that their interests outweigh their obligations, the Senate has no military force of its own to impose its will. This impotence is not new. The Senate has always depended on generals to execute its policies, has never had independent military capacity. But in the past, generals accepted senatorial authority as legitimate. Once that acceptance ends, the Senate becomes irrelevant to the real conflicts determining Rome's future. Republican laws bend under emergency measures, justified as temporary expedients but accumulating into permanent erosion of constitutional norms. Each crisis brings decrees granting extraordinary authority, suspending normal procedures, concentrating power to address threats that Republican institutions cannot handle through ordinary means. Each time Romans assure themselves that these measures are temporary, that Republican normalcy will return once the crisis passes. But crises become chronic, emergencies become normal, temporary measures become permanent. The Republic transforms through 1,000 small deviations from Republican practice, each justified individually, none quite revolutionary, but collectively adding up to fundamental transformation. The forms remain consuls, senate, assemblies, but they increasingly lack substance, becoming performances of Republican governance rather than actual Republican government. Julius Caesar accepts perpetual dictatorship, making explicit what has been implicit in his rule since crossing the Rubicon, that he intends to hold power permanently, that Republican offices have become merely vehicles for his authority, that the Republic exists only as long as Caesar allows it. Dictatorship, traditionally, is a temporary emergency office, appointed to handle specific crises and obligated to resign once the crisis passes. By accepting perpetual dictatorship, Caesar announces that the emergency is permanent, that Republican governance is permanently inadequate, that Roman safety requires permanent concentration of power in a single individual. This is honest in its way. Caesar stops pretending that he intends to restore Republican normalcy, acknowledges that he has replaced the Republic with personal rule, but honesty does not make it acceptable to those who still value Republican liberty. Julius Caesar is assassinated in the Senate House on the Ides of March 44 BCE, stabbed to death by senators who see his murder as tyrannicide, as the necessary act to restore Republican liberty, as the heroic deed that will allow Rome to return to constitutional governance. The conspirators believe that removing the tyrant will restore the Republic, that Caesar's death will allow Republican institutions to function again, that liberty can be recovered through this desperate act. They are wrong. Caesar's assassination does not restore the Republic but triggers another round of civil war, demonstrating that the Republic's problems are institutional and systemic, not merely the result of one man's ambition. The Republic cannot be saved by killing Caesar, because what destroyed the Republic was not Caesar, but the conditions that made Caesar possible. The concentration of military power, the loyalty of armies to generals, the failure of institutions to adapt to empire. Political violence accelerates rather than resolves crisis. Each murder and proscription creating new grievances, new factions, new reasons for vengeance. The assassination of Caesar leads to chaos, as his supporters and opponents struggle for control. Mark Antony, Octavian Caesar's adopted heir, and eventually Lepidus form a triumvirate to seize power and eliminate their enemies. They compile proscription lists, political opponents who may be killed on sight, and oversee mass executions that rival Sulla's earlier purges. Cicero, the great orator and defender of Republican values, is murdered, his head and hands displayed in the Forum. The Republic's last defenders are systematically eliminated, not through legal process but through political murder. Each purge creates new enemies, new cycles of revenge, new reasons for violence. The Republic dies not in a single catastrophic moment but through this prolonged agony of self-destruction. Romans expect restoration of Republican norms, clinging to hope that the present chaos is temporary. that once the current crisis resolves, constitutional governance will return. This expectation is understandable. Rome has weathered previous crises, previous periods of violence and instability, and republican institutions have always eventually reasserted themselves. Why should this crisis be different? Most Romans cannot imagine that the republic is actually dead, that the transformation they are living through is permanent rather than temporary. The forms remain, elections are still held, consuls still elected, the Senate still convenes. Surely these forms mean something. Surely republican governance continues beneath the surface turbulence. This hope blinds Romans to the reality that the republic is already gone, that what continues is mere performance, empty ritual, without substance. Octavian maneuvers power through legality and symbolism, learning from Caesar's mistake that open autocracy triggers resistance, that Romans will accept concentration of power if it is dressed in republican clothing, if it claims to restore rather than replace traditional governance. Octavian never calls himself king or dictator, never openly claims autocratic authority, never admits that he has replaced the republic with monarchy. Instead, he accumulates republican offices, holds consulship and tribunician power, controls military commands through provincial authority, dominates the Senate through personal influence. He presents himself as restoring the republic, returning power to Senate and people, rescuing Rome from chaos and civil war. And in a sense, he does restore peace and stability. What he does not restore, what cannot be restored, is actual republican governance, the meaningful distribution of power, the genuine constraint on individual authority that had made the republic republican. Augustus claims restoration of the republic while holding supreme authority, creating a political fiction that will sustain Roman governance for centuries. In 27 BCE, Octavian theatrically returns all his powers to the Senate, claiming that the emergency has passed and republican governance can resume. The Senate, in response, grants him extraordinary honors and the title Augustus. He accepts control of key military provinces, consolidates command over Roman legions, retains tribunician power, giving him veto over legislation. The result is that Augustus holds more power than Caesar ever did, but through republican offices rather than through dictatorship, through constitutional means rather than through open usurpation. The fiction is transparent. Everyone understands that Augustus rules Rome, but it is a useful fiction, allowing Romans to believe that the republic continues, that traditional governance persists, that the crisis was temporary rather than terminal. Peace returns under conditions no longer republican, and this Augustan settlement establishes the pattern for Roman imperial governance. There is peace, the civil wars have ended, stability has returned, prosperity is renewed, but republican governance is dead. The Senate advises but does not govern. Magistrates serve but wield no real power. Elections occur but outcomes are predetermined. The forms of the republic continue as hollow performances, theater designed to maintain continuity with tradition while concealing the fundamental transformation that has occurred. Romans gain peace and prosperity at the cost of political liberty, trading participation for security, accepting autocracy disguised as restoration. The transformation from republic to empire is complete, though few Romans at the time fully understand what has been lost or that the loss is permanent. The Pax Romana stabilizes territory through centralized command, replacing republican institutions with imperial administration, bringing unprecedented peace and prosperity to the Mediterranean world, while fundamentally transforming the nature of Roman governance. Augustus and his successors create a professional bureaucracy to handle taxation, a standing army to defend borders, an imperial cult to provide ideological unity, a clear hierarchy of authority with the emperor at its apex. The result is effective government, efficient administration, sustained peace across vast territories. The empire works brilliantly at providing what Romans want: security, order, prosperity. What it cannot provide is the political participation, the civic engagement, the shared governance that had characterized Republican Rome. The empire is administered rather than governed, with subjects rather than citizens, with imperial will rather than republican law as ultimate authority. Emperors rely increasingly on military loyalty rather than civic legitimacy, a fundamental shift in the basis of imperial authority that makes succession unstable and ties the emperor's power to his ability to satisfy military demands. Augustus establishes his power through military victory and maintains it through control of legions. But he carefully cultivates legitimacy through constitutional forms, through connection to Julius Caesar, through religious authority as Pontifex Maximus. Later, emperors have less ability to claim republican legitimacy and depend more nakedly on military support. The Praetorian Guard, the emperor's personal military force in Rome, becomes kingmaker, elevating and deposing emperors based on its own interests. Provincial armies back their commanders for emperor, leading to civil wars when multiple armies support different candidates. Military loyalty becomes the crucial factor determining who rules Rome, not heredity or constitutional procedure or senatorial acceptance. Bureaucratic administration expands to manage taxation and defense, creating layers of officials, record keepers, and functionaries to handle the practical work of governing a vast empire. The scale of the empire requires sophisticated administration census records to track taxable population, tax collectors to gather revenue, officials to oversee provincial governance, supply networks to provision armies, courier systems to transmit orders and information. This bureaucracy grows increasingly elaborate over centuries, becoming its own institutional force, developing procedures and hierarchies that gain momentum independent of particular emperors. The bureaucracy is essential for imperial function but also creates rigidity, making the system resistant to change, slow to adapt, dependent on procedures that may become obsolete but cannot easily be revised. The price of efficient administration is reduced flexibility. Expansion slows, removing the economic engine of conquest that had sustained Roman growth for centuries. The costs of maintaining borders begin to exceed the benefits of expansion. There are no more rich kingdoms to conquer, no more vast populations to enslave, no more territories whose conquest pays for itself. The frontiers stabilize along rivers and mountains: the Rhine, the Danube, the Euphrates, the North African desert boundaries that are defensible but expensive to maintain. The transition from expanding empire to defensive empire has profound economic consequences. Where Rome once paid for its growth through plunder and conquest, it must now pay for defense through taxation of existing territories. The system that worked brilliantly during expansion becomes much more challenging during consolidation. Economic pressure shifts from conquest to taxation, as the empire must fund its military and administration from internal resources rather than from external plunder. Provincial populations bear increasing fiscal burdens: taxes on land, on persons, on commerce, on inheritance. The tax burden grows not only to fund military defense, but also to support the growing bureaucracy, to finance imperial building projects, to provide grain subsidies for Rome's urban population, to maintain the infrastructure of empire. Some regions are taxed lightly, others heavily, depending on their wealth and strategic importance. The inequality of tax burden creates resentment, particularly when taxation enriches the empire's center while impoverishing its peripheries. The empire becomes an extractive system, drawing resources from provinces to sustain center and military, creating conditions that make provincial populations less invested in empire's survival. Succession lacks constitutional clarity, a fundamental flaw in the imperial system that creates periodic crises and makes long-term planning difficult. The Republic had clear constitutional procedures for transferring power elections, term limits, defined magistracies. The empire has none. Emperors attempt various solutions, adopting capable heirs, establishing dynasties, designating co-emperors. None proves reliably successful. Too often, Succession is determined by military force, with armies backing different candidates and civil war resulting. The average emperor reigns only a few years, many dying violently. This instability makes effective governance difficult. An emperor must secure his own power before he can address empire-wide problems, and by the time he has secured power, he may be nearing death or facing military challenge. The constitutional void at the heart of imperial governance creates recurring crisis. Emperors rise through army support and fall through betrayal, creating a vicious cycle where military loyalty is essential for gaining and holding power, but can never be entirely trusted. An emperor who loses army support loses power, so emperors must constantly satisfy military demands, pay raises, bonuses, special privileges. But satisfying one part of the military may alienate others. An emperor elevated by the Praetorian Guard may face resistance from provincial armies. An emperor who favors frontier legions may face coup from the Guard. The military's political power becomes a trap. Emperors need it to rule, but cannot control it, must satisfy it, but can never fully trust it. The result is that military interests increasingly dominate imperial policy, with long-term strategic concerns subordinated to short-term need to maintain military loyalty. Short reigns undermine long-term governance, making it difficult to implement policies that take decades to show results. Impossible to maintain consistent strategy across administrations when administrations change every few years. An emperor might begin important reforms, restructuring defense, revising taxation, addressing economic problems, only to die or be overthrown before the reforms take effect. His successor, needing to establish his own authority and satisfy his own supporters, reverses or abandons the previous emperor's policies. Long-term problems require sustained attention, consistent policy, and willingness to bear short-term costs for long-term benefits. But when emperors rarely last more than a few years, such sustained attention is impossible. The empire lurches from crisis to crisis, each new emperor addressing immediate threats without ability to solve underlying problems. Provincial populations shoulder increasing fiscal burdens, both in direct taxation and in kind providing supplies for armies, housing imperial officials, supporting imperial infrastructure projects. As economic conditions deteriorate and inflation erodes the value of currency, tax demands increase. Provinces that once prospered under Roman peace find themselves impoverished by Roman taxation. The deal that had made empire acceptable, local autonomy in exchange for taxes and peace, becomes less attractive as taxes rise and peace becomes less reliable. Provincial populations have less stake in empire's survival when empire is primarily a source of demands rather than benefits. Loyalty to Rome becomes increasingly abstract, particularly for populations with no memory of pre-Roman conditions, no reason to prefer Roman governance to potential alternatives. Urban populations decline during plagues and economic crises, hollowing out the cities that had been centers of Roman civilization. Plague strikes repeatedly in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, killing substantial portions of the population, disrupting trade, undermining urban economies. Economic instability, currency debasement, and taxation drive rural populations away from cities. Urban infrastructure decays as tax revenues decline. The civic culture that had made Roman cities vibrant public buildings, theaters, baths, festivals, becomes impossible to sustain. Cities contract, populations fall. The urban civilization that had characterized Roman life gives way to more rural, localized patterns. This decline weakens the administrative structure of empire, which depends on cities as centers of governance, taxation, and culture. Local autonomy erodes under imperial centralization as emperors attempt to address crises by taking direct control of functions that had been locally managed. Standardization replaces diversity. Imperial officials replace local leaders. Central planning replaces local initiative. This centralization might improve administrative efficiency in theory, but in practice, It reduces the flexibility and local knowledge that had made Roman governance successful. Provinces lose the ability to address their own problems in ways suited to local conditions. Everything must be referred to central authority, creating delays and imposing solutions designed for empire-wide application that may not fit particular situations. The empire becomes more rigid, less responsive, less able to adapt to varying circumstances across its vast territories. Diocletian divides authority between multiple emperors in an attempt to address the crisis of governance, creating the tetrarchy rule by 4 emperors, 2 senior Augusti and 2 junior Caesares, dividing the empire into administrative regions, each with its own emperor. The system attempts to solve several problems simultaneously, providing clear succession by having junior emperors designated to succeed senior ones, enabling more rapid response to threats by having emperors stationed in different regions, reducing the administrative burden on any single ruler. The tetrarchy works during Diocletian's lifetime, bringing stability after decades of crisis, allowing systematic reform of administration, military, and taxation. But it requires cooperation among the 4 emperors, agreement on policy, acceptance of designated succession. When Diocletian retires, the system almost immediately breaks down into civil war, demonstrating that formal structures cannot replace the personal authority and political skill that made the tetrarchy temporarily successful. Administrative reform stabilizes crisis while reducing unity, dividing the empire into more manageable pieces, but weakening the sense of single Roman imperium. Diocletian's reforms multiply the number of provinces, creating smaller administrative units that are easier to govern but less powerful as regions. He multiplies bureaucracy, creating layers of officials to handle specialized functions. He standardizes taxation, imposing uniform systems across the empire. These reforms improve administrative efficiency, but also increase the size and cost of government, requiring higher taxation to support the expanded bureaucracy. The reforms preserve the empire but transform it, creating a more regimented, more hierarchical, more expensive system that bears little resemblance to earlier Roman governance. The empire survives by becoming something quite different from what it had been. Constantine relocates imperial focus to Constantinople, founding a new capital in the Greek East that will eventually become the center of a separate Eastern Roman Empire. Constantinople has strategic advantages, better positioned to defend against Persian and later threats. Located at the junction of trade routes between Europe and Asia, commanding access to the Black Sea. But the relocation of the capital shifts the empire's center of gravity away from Rome and Italy, acknowledging that the Western Mediterranean is no longer the empire's core. Rome becomes one city among many, important for its history and symbolism, but no longer the administrative or economic center. This geographic shift reflects underlying reality. The eastern provinces are wealthier, more urbanized, more economically productive. The empire's future lies in the east, which will eventually survive as Byzantium long after the West has fallen. Christianity reshapes imperial ideology and legitimacy, providing new basis for imperial authority, even as it transforms what it means to be Roman. Constantine's conversion and promotion of Christianity creates a Christian empire, where the emperor rules not only through military and administrative power, but through religious authority, where Christian bishops become part of the governance structure, where Christian theology shapes political legitimacy. Christianity provides ideological unity across diverse populations, a shared identity that transcends ethnic and regional differences. But it also creates new divisions between Christians and pagans, between orthodox and heretical, between competing interpretations of doctrine. Religious controversy becomes political crisis. Theological disputes threaten imperial unity. The emperor must now manage church as well as state. Christianity preserves the empire by providing new legitimacy, but also creates new vulnerabilities. The Roman Empire survives by abandoning earlier assumptions, by transforming so thoroughly that what endures barely resembles what had existed before. The empire of Constantine looks nothing like the Republic of Cicero or even the Principate of Augustus. Military defense replaces expansion. Bureaucratic administration replaces civic participation. Christian emperor replaces pagan princeps. Constantinople rivals Rome. The East surpasses the West in importance. Each transformation is justified as necessary for survival, as pragmatic response to crisis, as preservation of Rome. Yet, collectively, these transformations mean that Rome survives by ceasing to be Rome, that the empire preserves itself by becoming something that earlier Romans would barely recognize. The question becomes, at what point does preservation require so much transformation that what is preserved is no longer the thing being saved? Preservation requires transformation rather than continuity, a paradox that captures the tragedy of late Roman history. Romans understand that survival requires change, that institutions must adapt to circumstances, that rigid adherence to tradition means death. Yet every adaptation moves further from republican ideals. Every reform concentrates more power. Every crisis justifies more centralization. The empire that survives is no longer the republic that had conquered the Mediterranean, no longer the civic culture that had made Rome distinctive, no longer the system of shared governance and rule of law that Romans had believed made them superior to other peoples. What survives is power without the principles that had constrained it, administration without the participation that had legitimized it, order without the flexibility that had made it sustainable. The Romans saved the empire by transforming it into something that cannot be saved. The Western Roman Empire dissolves politically in 476 AD, though no one living through this year experiences it as catastrophic ending or definitive break with the past. Romulus Augustulus, the last Western emperor, is deposed by Odoacer, but life continues with remarkable continuity. The same bishops administer cities. The same roads carry travelers. The same laws govern disputes. The same Latin is spoken in churches and law courts. What ends is not Roman civilization, but the political structure of the Western Empire, the administrative apparatus centered in Italy, the imperial court that had claimed authority over Western provinces. The Eastern Empire continues in Constantinople, maintaining Roman imperial tradition, preserving Roman law and governance, considering itself the Roman Empire. The end of the West is thus not the end of Rome, but a geographic contraction, a recognition that unity can no longer be maintained, that the empire has fragmented into pieces that will develop separate identities and histories. The Eastern Roman Empire endures as Byzantium, continuing Roman imperial tradition for another 1,000 years until Constantinople falls to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. Byzantium maintains the fiction of Roman continuity. Its emperors are Roman emperors, its people are Romans, its law is Roman law. Yet Byzantium evolves into something distinctly different from classical Rome, Greek rather than Latin in language, Orthodox Christian rather than pagan in religion, medieval rather than ancient in culture. Byzantium demonstrates that Roman political forms can survive in dramatically changed circumstances, that adaptation can preserve core elements even while transforming surface features. Yet Byzantium's survival also highlights what the West loses: centralized administration, urban civilization, literary culture, the organizational capacity to mobilize resources and defend borders. The divergence between East and West becomes the defining feature of post-Roman Mediterranean history. Roman law survives through legal codes and institutions, becoming perhaps Rome's most enduring legacy. Justinian's codification of Roman law in the 6th century preserves centuries of legal development, making Roman jurisprudence accessible to later generations who will build European legal systems on Roman foundations. Roman legal concepts, property rights, contracts, torts, procedure. The distinction between public and private law shape Western legal thought to the present. Roman law proves more durable than Roman emperors, surviving not through political continuity but through intellectual influence. through its superiority as a system of thought about justice and social order. The law outlives the lawgivers. The principles persist after the empire that embodied them has dissolved. This survival suggests that Rome's greatest achievement was not military conquest or political organization, but the creation of a systematic approach to law that could be learned, transmitted, and adapted across cultures and centuries. Republican civic participation disappears permanently, and with it goes the tradition of citizen engagement that had characterized Roman political culture. Medieval and early modern Europeans will idealize the Roman Republic, will invoke republican virtue and civic engagement as models. But the actual practice of shared governance, of citizens actively participating in political decisions, of power distributed across assemblies and magistracies, this disappears with the Republic and does not return. What replaces it is hierarchy, hereditary authority, rule by aristocratic elites who govern subjects rather than fellow citizens. The emperor is succeeded by kings who claim absolute authority, the Senate by hereditary nobility, the citizen assemblies by nothing at all. The idea of citizenship itself transforms, becoming legal status rather than political participation, conferring rights but not power, protecting individuals but not empowering them. The loss is profound and permanent. Political flexibility yields to rigid hierarchy as medieval European society organizes itself into fixed estates, nobility, clergy, commoners with little mobility between them. The Roman system had been hierarchical but never entirely rigid. Wealth could buy political influence, military success could elevate families. The empire incorporated diverse peoples into common citizenship. Medieval Europe is far more stratified, far less flexible, far more insistent on fixed social position determined by birth. This rigidity reflects Christian influence, Germanic tradition, and economic conditions of medieval life, but it also represents loss of Roman principles of legal equality and earned status. Society becomes more stable in some ways, but also more ossified, less able to reward merit, less open to social mobility, less dynamic than Roman society at its height. Provincial experiences vanish from surviving records, creating a massive gap in historical knowledge. Most surviving sources were written by elite Roman authors, presenting events from imperial perspective, concerned with politics in Rome and warfare on frontiers. What we lack are voices of provincials, perspectives of the conquered, experiences of ordinary people living under Roman rule. We don't know how most people experienced Roman governance, whether they welcomed or resented it, how their lives changed under Roman administration. We don't know what Gauls thought about Caesar's conquest, what Britons thought about Hadrian's Wall, what Africans thought about Roman taxation. This silence in sources means we reconstruct Roman history largely from the perspective of those who ruled, understanding empire from the center rather than from the margins, telling the story of power rather than the story of those subject to power. Competing theories attempt to explain Rome's fall, each emphasizing different factors, each capturing some truth but none sufficient alone. Moral decay theories emphasize ethical decline, arguing that Rome fell because Romans lost the republican virtue that had made them great, became corrupted by wealth and power, abandoned the discipline and self-restraint that had characterized their ancestors. This explanation appeals to those who see history as moral drama, who believe virtue and vice determine historical outcomes. It has elements of truth. There was corruption, there was loss of republican virtue, but it overstates moral factors while understating structural problems. Rome did not fall primarily because Romans became immoral, but because institutions failed to adapt, because military power destroyed political balance, because the system that worked brilliantly during expansion could not adjust to consolidation. Economic explanations emphasize overextension and resource strain, arguing that Rome collapsed under the weight of its own size, that the costs of defending vast frontiers exceeded the empire's economic capacity, that taxation necessary for defense impoverished the provinces being defended. This explanation highlights real problems. Defense was expensive, taxation was burdensome, economic productivity declined. But it struggles to explain why the East survived when facing similar problems, why some provinces remained prosperous while others declined, why economic strain produced collapse in the West but adaptation in the East. Economic factors matter, but cannot alone explain the differential fate of Eastern and Western empires. Transformation theories emphasize continuity without empire, arguing that Rome did not fall so much as transform, that Roman civilization survived the end of Roman political structures, that what we call the fall of Rome is really the transition from ancient to medieval world, a change in political forms rather than collapse of civilization. This interpretation captures important truths. Civilization did continue. Roman influence persisted. Many Roman institutions survived in modified form, but it risks minimizing the genuine trauma of empire's end, the suffering caused by political fragmentation, the loss of security and prosperity that many regions experienced, the very real collapse of urban civilization in many areas. Transformation theories correctly emphasize continuity, but sometimes downplay the cost of transformation. No single explanation resolves every contradiction or accounts for the full complexity of Rome's fall. The reality is that Rome fell for many reasons, that structural, economic, military, political, and cultural factors all contributed, that different regions experienced different trajectories, that the fall was process rather than event, transformation rather than destruction. Attempting to identify the cause of Rome's fall is probably misguided. There was no single cause, no single moment of failure, no simple answer to a complex historical process. What we can say is that the Roman Empire proved unable to adapt its institutions to changed circumstances, that the system which had built empire could not sustain it indefinitely, that order itself became obstacle to necessary evolution, that Rome fell because it could not preserve itself without transforming into something that was no longer recognizably Roman. The legacy of uncertainty is that Rome becomes both warning and model for all subsequent empires, a story told to justify or critique power, invoked to support or oppose expansion, remembered selectively to serve various political purposes. Every empire since Rome has compared itself to Rome, has studied Roman history for lessons, has attempted to avoid Rome's fate while replicating Rome's success. The question, why did Rome fall, is really the question, how can we avoid falling, asked by every powerful state fearing its own decline. Rome's fall teaches that success does not guarantee survival, that institutions must evolve or ossify, that power contains the seeds of its own destruction. Yet the lesson is ambiguous. Rome fell, but it also lasted longer than almost any other empire, achieved more, influenced more, left greater legacy. Is Rome's fall a story of failure or of remarkable success, given the circumstances? The answer depends on perspective, on what aspects of Rome one values, on whether one emphasizes the fall or the centuries of achievement that preceded it. Later, empires attempt to imitate Rome's order while fearing its fate, creating a fundamental tension in political thought about empire. Charlemagne claims Roman inheritance, establishing Holy Roman Empire that will last 1,000 years while never matching Rome's actual power. Napoleon studies Roman military history while attempting to conquer Europe. British Empire identifies itself as Rome's successor, speaking of Pax Britannica, echoing Pax Romana. American founders debate Roman lessons, arguing about whether America should emulate Republican Rome or fear its transformation to empire. Every empire wants Rome's success but fears Rome's fall, wants Rome's order but fears Rome's rigidity, wants Rome's power but fears Rome's fate. Yet none can escape the paradox. Rome demonstrates that the order which creates empire eventually destroys the empire's ability to adapt. The absence of a single cause becomes the lesson, the recognition that complex systems fail through accumulation of problems rather than through single catastrophic event, that the fall is process rather than moment, that understanding collapse requires understanding multiple interacting factors rather than identifying one decisive failure. This lesson is uncomfortable because it denies simple answers, prevents easy analogies, makes prediction difficult. If Rome fell for many reasons, how can we know which factors matter for other empires? If the fall was process rather than event, how can we identify when an empire is falling versus merely changing? If transformation and collapse are difficult to distinguish, how can we know if current crises represent existential threats or normal evolution? The absence of simple cause and effect narrative makes Rome's fall intellectually frustrating but historically honest, acknowledging complexity rather than reducing it to manageable simplicity. Roman roads continue carrying travelers centuries after imperial collapse, their stone surfaces still bearing the weight of merchants and messengers, pilgrims and armies, the infrastructure of empire outlasting the empire that built it. These roads were engineering marvels, constructed to last not decades but centuries, built with such skill that many remain in use to the present day, their paths determining medieval trade routes, their bridges still spanning rivers, their very existence shaping the geography of settlement and commerce long after Rome ceased to exist. The roads embody Roman values, practicality, durability, system, order, and their survival suggests something profound about the nature of Rome's legacy. What endures from Rome is not political power or military might, but the systems Rome created, the infrastructure that organized space, the institutions that structured society, the law that governed relations. The roads remain when the legions are gone. The aqueducts function when the emperors are deposed. The legal principles persist when the Senate is dissolved. Systems outlive the powers that construct them, a truth that applies beyond Rome to all complex civilizations, all elaborate social organizations. Political authority is temporary, military power is fleeting. Rulers come and go, but the structures they create, the systems they establish, the institutions they build, can persist for centuries, serving purposes their creators never imagined, surviving the collapse of the states that made them. This persistence is Rome's greatest achievement, and perhaps its greatest curse. The persistence means Roman influence continues long after Rome itself has ended, means European civilization builds on Roman foundations, means we still live with the consequences of Roman decisions made 2,000 years ago. But the persistence also meant that Rome could not easily change its own systems, could not adapt institutions that had become fundamental to how Romans understood civilization, could not abandon structures even when those structures became obstacles to survival. The image of enduring roads invites reflection on the relationship between order and adaptation, between the stability that systems provide and the flexibility that survival requires. Rome built magnificent order roads that connected empire, laws that governed relations, administrative systems that managed complexity, military organizations that defended borders. This order was Rome's genius, the source of its power and prosperity. Yet this same order eventually became trap, as institutions designed for one set of circumstances proved unable to handle different conditions, as systems that worked brilliantly during expansion failed during consolidation, as the very perfection of Roman order prevented the adaptations necessary for survival. The roads remain, but the empire that built them is gone. The law survives, but the republic that created it has vanished. What persists is infrastructure, system, framework, but not the living political community that gave these things meaning. Somewhere between the laws that built empire and the power that consumed restraint, between the republican institutions that prevented tyranny and the imperial authority that those institutions could not contain, between the order that conquered the world and the rigidity that prevented adaptation, Rome discovered that order can conquer the world but cannot always survive its own success. This is the final paradox, the ultimate lesson, the truth that echoes through Roman history and haunts all subsequent empires. Order is necessary. Without it, there is only chaos, only the war of all against all. only the brutal struggle for survival. Rome proved that order can accomplish extraordinary things, can create civilization from wilderness, can bring prosperity from chaos, can generate achievements that endure for millennia. Yet order is not sufficient. Order without flexibility becomes rigidity. System without adaptation becomes obsolescence. Law without evolution becomes obstacle. The very perfection of Roman order made it impossible to change that order when change became necessary. The question that began this exploration returns now with new weight. If Rome's order created the greatest empire in history, why could that same order not save it? We have seen the answer unfold across centuries of Roman history. The order that built the Republic could not accommodate empire. The institutions that prevented tyranny could not control ambitious generals. The legal frameworks that worked for a city-state could not govern a Mediterranean empire. The systems that succeeded brilliantly during expansion failed catastrophically during consolidation. Rome's order was its strength and its weakness, its greatest achievement and ultimate downfall. The order created empire, but the rigidity of that order prevented adaptation, and the inability to adapt doomed the empire when circumstances changed in ways Roman institutions could not handle. Yet the answer remains somehow incomplete, for the question implies that order should be able to save itself, that a sufficiently good system should be sustainable indefinitely, that proper institutions should be able to evolve as circumstances demand. The Roman experience challenges these assumptions. Perhaps no order can adapt indefinitely. Perhaps all systems contain the seeds of their own obsolescence. Perhaps the very characteristics that make a system successful in one era make it fragile in another. Perhaps order necessarily becomes rigid, institutions necessarily resist change, systems necessarily prefer preservation to adaptation. If this is true, then Rome's fall is not failure, but inevitability. Not a problem that better leadership could have solved, but a trajectory that all complex systems eventually follow success. Consolidation, rigidity, obsolescence, collapse. Yet there is another way to understand Rome's legacy, one that acknowledges failure while honoring achievement. Rome lasted nearly 1,000 years, from the founding of the Republic to the fall of the Western Empire. During that millennium, Rome brought unprecedented prosperity, peace, and civilization to the Mediterranean world. Roman law shaped Western legal thought. Roman infrastructure enabled commerce and communication. Roman administration showed how large territories could be effectively governed. Roman literature, philosophy, and art established standards that subsequent generations would admire and imitate. Rome's fall does not erase these achievements or make them meaningless. The roads still carry travelers, the laws still govern relations. The ideas still inspire thinkers. Rome fell, but Rome also succeeded magnificently, achieved impossibly much, created institutions and systems and ideas that outlasted the empire itself. The gap between Rome's achievement and Rome's fall is what makes Roman history tragic rather than merely sad, what makes contemplating Rome's end philosophically profound rather than simply historically interesting. Rome did everything right, built magnificent institutions, created effective systems, established rule of law, incorporated diversity, developed sophisticated administration. Yet Rome still fell, not through stupidity or incompetence, not through simple mistakes or obvious failures, but through the inevitable logic of institutions becoming rigid, of order resisting change, of systems that could conquer the world but could not adapt to their own success. This is not a failure that better emperors or wiser senators could have prevented. This is the tragedy of human achievement itself, that our greatest creations eventually destroy us, that our most successful systems eventually fail, that the order we build to protect us eventually traps us. The forum remains empty, weeds growing between marble stones, the silence of absence replacing the noise of civic life. But the roads remain, carrying traffic, serving purposes their builders never imagined, enduring through centuries of change. And in this persistence of Roman infrastructure, in this survival of Roman systems, in this endurance of Roman achievements long after Rome itself has dissolved, we find Rome's true legacy, not political dominion but conceptual frameworks, not military power but systematic order, not empire but the idea of empire, not Rome but Romanness, not the state but the civilization that outlives the state, not the power that commanded but the systems that persist, demonstrating that what humans build can outlast their builders, that order can survive beyond those who create it, and that sometimes survival requires transformation so complete that what survives is no longer quite what was built, yet carries within it the essential DNA of its origins, evolving into something new while remaining somehow, fundamentally, recognizably Roman. And so Rome teaches us that order can conquer the world but cannot always survive its own success, that institutions which create power eventually become obstacles to necessary change, that the systems which make civilization possible eventually make adaptation impossible, that there is no final solution to political organization, no perfect constitution, no institutional arrangement that will endure forever, only temporary successes and inevitable transformations, only the endless human struggle to create order that will preserve freedom, to build systems that will remain flexible, to establish institutions that will adapt rather than ossify, a struggle that Rome pursued with unique brilliance for nearly a millennium, before the contradictions inherent in all order finally consumed even Roman order, leaving roads that endure, laws that persist, and questions that echo through empty forums, questions about power and its limits, about order and its fragility, about how to build systems that survive success, questions we still ponder today whenever we stand in Rome's shadow, contemplating the ruins of the greatest empire the world has ever known, wondering how it fell, knowing that however we answer, the answer will be incomplete, for Rome's fall was not simple failure but complex tragedy, not catastrophic collapse but gradual dissolution, not ending but transformation into something that carries Rome's legacy forward, even as Rome itself recedes into history, into myth, into memory, into the eternal question, echoing through abandoned basilicas and along enduring roads. How does order survive its own success?